from Evgeny Sachkov with Inform Защита, and he happens to be in charge of risk management there. Good evening. Name is Evgeny Sachkov, and I work for a company called Inform Защита, which is actually Russian for information protection. And indeed, I am the head of the risk management division, and I am going to tell you about the results of our, research studies, shall I call them red teaming studies, around a number of SOCs. Let me first explain why I actually want to talk about it. We actually believe that the main objective of risk analysis is to assist the decision makers in making better decisions. In order for this to be possible, the results of analysis should better be trustworthy. And in order for these results to be credible, the analysis itself must be reproducible. That is, if you hire different experts, they should ideally arrive at very similar conclusions. And it should also be consistent. Consistency is when the same expert will produce, pretty much the same judgment or will correct his previous judgments on the basis of new incoming information. This, however, leads to several problems. First is that the analysis you have performed will sometimes fail to support any judgment on whether all the information has been taken into account. For example, your red teaming team may have failed to take into account some incident statistics or certain business processes may have not been taken into account. Another problem is that sometimes it is pretty difficult to take into account specific data coming, for example, from pen testers who will tell you about, say, a successful attack along a particular vector. This is something that you rarely put in your risk report. Actually, the existing incumbent systems often do not allow for such information to be properly incorporated. I mean, whenever it happens, it is usually done through a heroic effort by the experts themselves. What also happens quite often is that experts will often pass a judgment on the probability of a particular risk, and this probability parameter will often be measured qualitatively, that is, low, medium, or high. And the funny thing is that different experts will actually disagree on what these monikers mean in mathematics terms. Even if previous agreement on terminology seems to have been reached, even such seemingly obvious things as 100% probability are construed differently. For example, some people believe that 100% probability means that every attempt will be successful, while others believe that 100% probability is one incident per year. And because of that, expert assessments may differ considerably. There is an author called Douglas Hubbard, and he published several books on risk management and risk analysis. He's got even a book called How to Measure Just About Anything. And there he has a story about how he ran a test. He called in a number of security experts. He gave them the same input data. And then these experts, on the basis of their experience and the same input data, would develop various parametric assessments. Actually, funnily enough, he showed that even the same experts being given the same information would arrive at different conclusions if this was performed at different moments in time, which means that time itself is a factor. Well, the case may be that this particular expert read about recent news, read about, say, a recent hack attempt, or maybe on a particular day he would be thinking more about a particular sub-process, and that would impact his or her judgment. So in combination, these three problems
Каждый год результаты анализа могут сильно отличаться там, где
result in the following situation. Analysis results year on year would very often differ when they shouldn't, because the business processes didn't change, because, say, adversary tactics have not changed.
заметные отличия,
And still, you would see significant differences. And on the other hand,
процесс мог
expert judgments may seem to be the same, although business processes have changed considerably. For example, the information system now in operation is different, or maybe new defense mechanisms have been deployed.
происходит. Может так получиться, что
So when this happens, it can easily happen that a decision maker
человек, которому дают результат анализа для того, чтобы он
who is actually being given those expert findings
его просто пытаются
will come to the conclusion that the experts are trying to dupe him, to lead him to believe that, say, new information security tools need to be deployed. And from that moment on, he may start thinking that information security is just a cost center. Although, alternatively, we can consider information security an investment.
принимающие решения, как
I'm stressing decision makers so much. I'm actually assuming that decision makers are higher ranked than CISOs,
директору службы информационной безопасности
simply because CISOs
согласовывать бюджеты.
usually need to get somebody's agreement on their new budgets, or they need to prove
Изменения в подразделении
the veracity of yet another decision they're about to start implementing.
организовано так, что вы как руководитель
And if the structure of a company's operations is such that,
можете,
as the head of information security department, you can make most decisions yourself,
то я надеюсь, что вы, по крайней мере, сами заинтересованы в том,
I do hope you are duly interested in making decisions
анализе каких-то аргументов,
which will be data-driven,
данных,
which will be based on real and reliable data.
решения, а не намерены делать себе
That's why,
предложения и
you can avoid acting on the basis of spurious
следующее.
impressions.
Первое – это как можно повысить воспроизводимость и консистентность анализа.
But what can we do? How can we increase reproducibility and consistency of our analysis?
Это бесполезно,
I'm emphasizing this because without this, it will be nearly impossible for you to incorporate the findings of pen testers or a SOC analysis. My second question is, how can you actually use their findings as input parameters for your analysis? And the third question is, how can you further use such analysis? How should we best develop the final documents,
для того, чтобы подавать их на
the
рассмотрение.
final reports, which will then be read by the key decision makers in the company?
Когда речь заходит об анализе рисков,
As long as we talk about risk analysis, we will always run into the same problem. That is, the problem that we cannot predict the future.
здесь не одинокая.
Information security is certainly not alone in this respect. You will see the same in so many other areas. Take investment as an analogy.
Какое-нибудь приложение для инвестирования,
Take an investment application.
там вкладка с рекомендациями.
There will certainly be a tab containing recommendations from financial advisors and actually traders, brokers, financial advisors. Although they tend to operate on the basis of their own models, as, for example, they try to predict changes in currency exchange, in
Если
in terms of evolution of the stocks of this or that company, whereas they try to predict
предлагает
demand for certain bonds.
которые они ранее рекомендовали,
No, very often
например, продать какие-то акции и вложить деньги в новые,
they will change their recommendations. Saying, you know what, we made a forecast previously and this forecast did not come true.
анализа. Вообще
Does it mean we should never trust them?
модель
No, it doesn't.
позволяет
If a model you're using,
ходить в плюс,
on average,
не работает как
gives you higher than zero results, if it is not a cargo cult, if it does not confuse
но в нашем
causes with consequences,
встретить мнение, что
it should be relied upon.
неточных оценок
However, what we see quite often is that even if a single forecast is wrong, this means that the analyst
в вакууме.
doesn't know what he's doing.
Анализ рисков по своему смыслу ближе, наверное, к прогнозу погоды.
He doesn't know his ass from his hat. And risk analysis is closer to weather forecasts.
Предугадать события, которые
It is impossible to predict everything that's going to happen, given how many externalities determine our life. However, we can try to be more right than wrong.
на факторный анализ риска
What I'm going to talk about is primarily based on risk factor analysis described in the Open FAIR standard
управление информационным риском
and also in the books called Measuring and Managing Information Risks and
кибербезопасности,
How to Measure Pretty Much Anything in Cybersecurity.
который есть в анализе, это необходимость
Arguably, the most important thing in cyber analysis is the need to define what it is exactly that we're trying to assess.
мало скоп работы.
It is incredibly important that the whole team has total alignment on the understanding of our scope.
Что мы делаем
It may sound obvious,
нашего анализа.
but it isn't.
Но на деле я часто встречал
What
ситуацию,
has
что
happened in my practice very often
эксперты
was that on the same team you would have different experts
которые
using different definitions, even for such common terms as risk.
мы предлагаем вместо параметра риск
That's why
оценивать сценарии.
We actually propose using scenarios as opposed to using risks, because there is significantly less confusion about this term.
Факторы как актив, эффект от воздействия
If
и
you're
источник угрозы,
looking at scenarios which operate with the source of threat, impact, and asset, it should be easy to define your scenario in a non-confusing, unambiguous manner.
актив нам здесь нужен, потому что
Obviously, we need to identify assets each and every time,
неточное определение актива,
because if we do not define the asset properly,
размер потерь, который
if we don't define the asset clearly, we will not be able to properly assess the impact. Simply because different experts
оцениваем вообще воздействие.
may disagree on the scope of an asset. For example, an expert may think we're only talking about data integrity or data availability, while another expert may think that we are also looking at the availability of the infrastructure, where the same data is maintained.
Потому что мы можем получить, опять же, разные
And this should be
размеры потерь.
an interesting discussion, because depending on your definition, your assessment of the impact or the potential damages obviously will differ, and quite often risk triggers will differ as well.
Каждый атакующий
And we also need to agree in each of these scenarios on a source of threat, because different attackers have their own patterns of motivations and capabilities.
же мы не можем нормально оценить, помогают ли вообще наши механизмы защиты.
So if we're not clear about the source of threat, it will be difficult for us to assess whether our protection mechanisms are any good. Let's assume we have agreed on what it is that we are assessing and analyzing.
Воспроизводимость
If this is the case, how do we increase the reproducibility of our analysis? How do we increase the precision of the expert's assessment so that experts really
и, наверное, основное
have comfort that they are working on the same thing?
перейти от
First and foremost,
оцениваемых параметров
we need to transition
к
from, well, not exactly abstract parameters, but rather ambiguous parameters or variables, such as reputation damage, probability, to things that the experts will agree upon, such as frequency of losses, share of clients who will leave us because of that, reduction in company value, which obviously will apply to publicly traded companies. Also, each judgment that we are going to make will need to be made in a particular chain: asset, source, impact. And we don't try to make a common judgment here on the malignancy, so to speak, of the source, maliciousness of the source. Also, it should be useful to provide probability ranges. Actually, a range of assessments can be much more instrumental, like base expectation, pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. You can do this instead of probability ranges. Also, it's good practice to provide some arguments for why you came up with this scenario and you provided such and such assessment. It may turn out, for example, that in a given company, not a single person knows how to produce a well-argued-for judgment or assessment. And this is obviously not the problem of the experts in question. It's an important result. It's a very important finding. It may turn out that the top managers of the company, within the scope of the process understanding they have, and it doesn't have to be profound, like they are interested in the results alone. This does happen from time to time. So they may think that everything is crystal clear, the Dunning-Kruger Effect, so to speak. In the moment when you discover that nobody can really provide you with a clearly argued-for assessment, may be a signal that there is a loophole in the company's operations. In this case, your analysis will benefit from you stating clearly that together with the team you have not been able to clearly assess a certain area. That way, in the next iteration, it will be easier for you to get back to this item, recollect that you have failed at that exercise, and maybe by this time, the team will find a way to reduce uncertainty, and you will be able to pass a judgment. The advantages of this approach are such that you will be able to calibrate your assessment. For example, a year later, you are running another assessment, and you see that some of your data comes from internal statistics, some data comes from the expert who shared his suppositions and he explained why he had them, and some data you simply failed to collect. And then you can do comparisons. For example, you can take corporate statistics and quickly update the data. In the second case, you can actually compare experts' expectations to real findings. And it may turn out that due to some reasons, the expert had a totally different opinion. Maybe they thought that the business process would be more successful. Or maybe the expert thought he would be facing a higher level of malicious activity. So that will give you an opportunity to consider if you want to correct the expert's findings or expert's expectations. At the same time, it will be very clear which information you took into account, which you didn't, and if there are new sources of information being used, for example, pen test findings, pen testing reports, it will be easier for you to update your assessments.
Это была часть, которая касалась
So
именно
this is the part
воспроизводимости.
on reproducibility and consistency of results.
Каким образом можно
Let's turn now to the next subject, which is taking into account the findings of pen testing team and SOC.
ранее
Everything I've covered so far has been,
учитывать информацию в анализе в целом?
scaffolding for taking all this information into account.
Мы обычно занимаемся оценкой частотной составляющей.
In the information security industry, we very often have to assess frequency of potential losses. And there are different ways of doing that. You can use frameworks such as IRAM that enable you to take into account the quality of specific defenses, the quality of their implementation, and arrive finally at scores denoting the level of protection. Such an approach can be good
Результаты по проведению комплексного аудита и
if you want to combine your complex IT audit findings with other studies. However, it may sometimes fail to correlate with reality.
качественно вы реализовали какую-то защитную меру.
Actually, none of the business clients cares about, none of the attackers cares about the quality of your defenses. They will be looking for loopholes in your defenses, or the areas where your defenses are misconfigured, or they will try to find another way to break in. So the areas where you have succeeded very well don't matter to them too much. Even if some of your defenses are ideal,
Каких-то навыков социнженерии.
this doesn't mean the attacker will not be successful, because there is always social engineering and there are additional channels that your defenses may fail to cover.
Более реалистичный анализ.
In order to conduct more realistic studies, we need
Просто насколько у нас
more surfaces, let's put it like this.
защитные меры. И здесь
Simply having points that show the putative quality of your defenses is certainly not good enough. That's where SOCs and pen testers come in. As pen testing teams run their projects, they can imitate different calibers of threats, and they can start their tests having different levels of privileges at the very beginning. This kind of studies can be employed to see how your current defenses can help you thwart various levels of threats. And pen testers
актив, который они рассматривают.
can describe different vectors of attack against a particular asset you're interested in.
Успешно реализованные
Usually, they will describe the vectors that were successfully exploited or the vectors which are usually successfully exploited. It may very well be that they, for example, didn't have enough time to prove it in real life, or maybe in order to be successful they had to combine pen test with social engineering. But they can flag such vectors for you.
При этом, если проводился проект по Red Team, то
If you had a red
может
teaming
быть проверено,
project,
насколько
the red team
защита работает в реальной жизни.
could also enable you to check if your defenses
Системы безопасности,
are
у вас
any use, are any good in real life. For example, you have a security system, and people are only allowed to take assets out of the company if they have special passes. But does it really mean that, a criminal who has the gift of the gab will not be able to talk his way out through the security guard post, say, with a bag of servers?
теста, но сильнее это встречается в проектах по Red Team, могут быть
So, in red team tests, more often than in pen tests,
заранее просто не задумывались.
dramatically new impact scenarios may be discovered,
Новый предмет анализа, то есть новое
and they will therefore become a new object for your analysis.
воздействие и источник.
Or, to use our terminology for that, a new scenario linking asset,
Использование
threat source, and impact.
Чем нам в принципе может помочь СОК?
Where does SOC come into play?
В СОКа есть информация
First,
по инцидентам,
Security Operations Center will have information on incidents as well as information on attempted attacks.
Они это учитывают.
SOC will see anomalous activity. They will take it into account in their databases. They will also be able to share this information, and they will be analyzing it.
СОКи взаимодействуют с
Secondly, SOCs will be talking to regulators, and quite often they will collect information from the regulators, or they will deduce information based on their statistics about the new trends.
Наличие такой информации может
Information like this can help an analyst
где-то не просто учитывать статистику по организации, но эту статистику еще
It can help the analyst run statistics for a current company and even enrich it. It is becoming a trend now.
не знаю, инструменты для удаленного доступа.
For example, some remote access tools have been recently published, making it easier to hack certain class of systems. Once you learn about that, you should actually assign different weights to related threats.
При внедрении
Another area where SOC will come in handy
может заметить
is as follows. A SOC can, for example, measure how fast incident response happens, how fast a particular
в дальнейшем при анализе
intervention is detected.
общения с бизнес-подразделениями можно будет провести анализ
This can be very useful information later on when you talk to your business partners.
до того, как
When, for example, you need to tell them that your SOC has been able to detect and respond before
в случае
the attacker started damaging the system, or when they were able to curtail the damage being inflicted.
потерь, которые были в этом переводе,
Well, for example,
потому что
with financial fraud,
лечить.
quite often some of the losses are recovered because the fraudsters don't have enough time to cash their chips in.
Более грамотно учитывать информацию.
So having, this knowledge is extremely important.
А информацию, которую мы получаем от
The information we get from pen testers or SOC
специалистов, которые участвуют в оценке,
or other experts involved in the assessment
детализации,
can be used at different levels,
пытаться оценивать
or we can deal with different levels of granularity of this information. For example, frequency of events and frequency of losses can be considered and analyzed right away. This, however, requires having reliable statistics, understanding of trends, and if the weights are fine, then we probably don't even need to go to a more detailed level of analysis.
тех ресурсов, которые могут
This will enable us to save time, because in risk analysis there are so many ways of wasting your time on analysis.
то иметь
If we do not have stats that we can rely on, it makes sense to go a level deeper.
как часто пытаются провести
And in particular, consider how often attempted attacks are made,
это будут успешно реализованы.
and also what are the probabilities, what are the chances that such attempted attacks will be successful. Here, you can rely on expert assessments,
От чего могут какие механизмы защиты помочь, и при этом понимают, насколько в целом
and you will need to talk to experts who understand
воздействия и разные источники угроз.
both about defenses and about potential threats.
Более детально полученные уже, например,
But you can also use more detailed information obtained during pen tests.
пентестов, то есть
Not just pen tests, in fact. At this more detailed level, you will be interested in, for example, frequency of contact with the threat source
реализовать, когда
and the level of potential motivation that this source has.
возможность этого источника угроз.
Next, you will try to assess the capabilities of this source as well as your defensive capabilities.
Сработает вариант, когда
At this level of granularity,
второй атак
it helps to have a good understanding of potential attack vectors, potential kill chains,
от пентестеров, как они
and also some pen test findings,
злоумышленника могли обходить механизмы
because pen testers should tell you how hackers of different caliber would attack your system.
на уровень
So as you go to this deeper level of analysis,
анализа, что нам
your analysis should support better informed decisions. For example, you may realize that you're lacking certain defense tools, or that specific types of threats, specific sources of threat, will have the biggest impact. The more profound your analysis is, the more difficult it will be, and the more we will depend on the quality of input data for each and every parameter being assessed. Because obviously, if we use garbage information, chances are there will be too much noise in our findings. And the basic principle here is to use the best available information. So if you have some ready analysis coming from pen testers or from some other study, it makes sense to apply it. If you don't, it is usually a good practice to go one level higher in order to avoid analysis paralysis. Because at a higher level, you should be able some other information maybe pertaining to some other areas, and maybe you will be able to find other applicable information elsewhere and start reacting to events. All in all, there are three options, three scenarios rather, where we can model frequency of losses. One is when we take live incident statistics and we take changes in trends into account. This is as direct an assessment as assessments can get, because you apply the same range everywhere, and that's it. The second scenario involves the highest level of detail, and there you will be using several different assessment ranges at the same time. Well, for example, if pen testers have identified a particular attack vector, this doesn't really mean that such attacks can always be conducted. It may easily happen that a hacker who is less lucky or poorly qualified will not even try this attack vector and will be detected elsewhere, where, for example, your defenses are better. And the third scenario involves modeling of the frequency of attempts and success of intervention. And this is like the middle way, where we can hardly take all the top-level incident information correctly, and the same actually applies to pen tester information. So we need to summon experts who will submit, who will provide their expert opinions. However, this is still better than just asking them cold about it. Because when they do this kind of analysis, they will have to limit themselves to a particular threat profile. They will think about, say, a number of attempts that a hacker will need to undertake in order to be successful, given a certain level of privileges. So if we consider, say, an administrator to be a threat source, and you have few admins and they have access to pretty much everything, chances of success will always be somewhere in the 90% range. Simply because there is no stopping a person who is the god of a particular infrastructure. So imagine that we have a range of assessments from experts. But also, we will be collecting various assessments on potential losses. And these will be diverse losses, because losses can be direct, such as, say, paying fines or restoring infrastructure, or, for example, we'll have to reissue plastic cards. But there are also secondary losses. Secondary losses will not necessarily happen, and they can only happen if primary losses happen. The logic there is pretty much the same. So I would rather skip it. Now imagine that we have a set of ranges for frequency and a set of ranges for potential losses. What do we do with this data? The easiest option is to actually take the extremes of these ranges, take the expected values, and then try to perform the same operations that we would have conducted had we simply had a single value. I'm saying value, although, the same would really apply to qualitative methods. We do believe that mathematical modeling, particularly Monte Carlo analysis or Monte Carlo simulation, is a very good fit here. As you probably remember, Monte Carlo simulation is based on the assumption that if you have a certain range defined, when a particular risk is triggered, its value will be randomly chosen from this range. Well, obviously, you need to define the particular random function because it can be based on the normal distribution, or it could be even distribution. And then you can take several random values from this range, and then you would perform all the usual operations on these inherently random values. This way, you will have an individual result, which obviously will not be the correct one, because you don't really know whether your random value has been correct. And chances are, it belongs in the correct range, but it's certainly not the one that's going to play out. But if you run this Monte Carlo simulation like 10,000 times, it will give you a new distribution. And this distribution will actually show the range of outcomes. You will be able to see from the visualization how often individual events will pop up. This modeling can be done in many areas. Well, we would previously use Excel spreadsheet to do that. Actually, the underlying formulas are very simple. Most of them are part of the off-the-shelf bundle. However, we are now using JupyterLab and Python to do that. When you have such a range, denoting frequency of loss events is the first step in our analysis. Our next step is to present these findings to the top managers. Usually the top managers will be interested not just in the number of potential incidents or the value of potential losses, but rather expected values over a fixed period of time. They're usually interested in, say, a 1-year time frame, but quite often they will be asking you questions with time frames related to their usual payback periods. So if the usual payback period for your company is 3 years, maybe you need to synchronize your analysis with the same time. So you may have, for example, a frequency distribution ranging from once in 5 years to 10 times in a year. You will need then to transform this value into how many times this can be expected to happen over the selected time frame, which means you kind of flip this value, and you do it in order to be able to use it in all the following calculations. At the beginning of my speech, I said that distrust on the part of the decision maker will lead to the to information security division being seen as a cost center. From the viewpoint of the company, it is best when divisions spend little and earn a lot. But quite often, we want like the work and the life of individual employees to be as convenient and as interesting as possible. Because doing routine stuff on a regular basis is dull. It's much better to automate it.
And in case the IT department is what we're talking about, of course, there's an interest that incidents should happen as rarely as possible. Because for the security official, it's important whether the incidents that have happened fall within the risk target that we have or not. Because they can be punished for any incidents, but that's just about keeping the nerves. Okay, and then it turns out that seemingly every group's interests are also of interest to other groups because they affect each other in their work. But these are not their native interests. The management is interested in risks from global perspectives, firstly, to understand the risk posture as such. Somebody needs to understand what they need to focus more and what less, where the most hazardous points are. The second thing is about understanding the priorities to consider specific processing methods. That is closer to what is being expected of prioritization by security people. And the third thing is about being able to analyze the specific solutions, how much, how fast this particular solution will be able to recoup the investment it is. So depending on what kind of analysis is of most interest to the management, the way you present the information based on that analysis will differ. Even if we are interested in the answers to all these questions, we need to understand the immediate goal right now, not to just overload the person with this information and help them focus on the task, on the objectives that they need to attend to. In the case where we consider all scenarios at once to understand the processing priorities, it would be interesting to bring across to the management, firstly, information about the losses per specific incident that may happen, the expected loss amount over the interval of time that the management is considering, for instance, till the end of the year, and the number of losses per unit of time. And so based on these parameters, you can then proceed to making a decision of what to focus first. In certain cases, it would be about solutions based on those, or decisions based on average values. In other cases, it would be about decisions based on incidents that would bring the biggest damage. So even if an incident like that is likely to happen very rarely, maybe once every 10 years. It's important to assess the impact beforehand. If we need to determine the profitability of investment that happens when we're considering a specific solution, we'll need to run the same analysis first for the second time. So, for instance, involving the people who are the owners of the business processes, involving the security people, so discussing certain points about, response options, processing options, what kinds of response measures work better, and then try to understand how expedient it would be to implement it in the whole. And here we could take the analysis that we have already run, understand which of the parameters in question the solution will affect. Will that cover all sources of hazards, or will it only affect a specific group? Will it bring about a reduction of costs per specific incident or not? And then we need to run the modeling or simulation once again and subject to analysis the difference between these two values. So using this approach to risk analysis does not mean that you need to always strictly use this schematic of assessment. For instance, Risk-Lens recently published a paper describing how they implemented risk analysis, considering that no new asset management system will be implemented, and that was not considered as a source of threat. So theoretically, one can consider the decision not being taken as a source of threat. As for the remaining parameters, they became a part of the assessment. So they considered the results of implementing the system or not implementing. And when they ran this comparison, it turned out that yes, a decision to implement a system makes sense if we consider the time horizon from 5 years and more. I hope I've been able to answer at least part of the questions that you had in mind when you decided to listen to my presentation. The questions that I see now as requiring additional work are related to the attempts of automating the analysis process. Is it possible to consider the trend information from the SOC automatically without involving a human? Is it possible to connect calculations regarding the coverage of the SOC, coverage of the technology map? And similar things. If you have any questions right now, I'm prepared to take them. I have one big question to you as the audience. Do you read papers or some materials regarding this subject in English, or do you use Russian information sources? That is, how demanding are you in this respect? So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much, Eugene. We have several questions. One of them is how long does this analysis take, and is it not excessive work? Well, perhaps it all depends on what you want to compare it specifically, because I've seen methodologies of qualitative risk assessment that take even more time. On the whole, it turned out that one scenario could be run and analyzed within 1 week, considering all the meetings you had to organize without previous exposure to the processes. So this is exactly the time when we find out how it all works, where we are, what the company has, and then it'll all depend on how closely these scenarios are. For specialists, professionals working within the organization, it would probably be easier because they will have already had quite a lot of information about the company as insiders. And if they use the existing knowledge of analysis tools. So, for instance, if they have prepared forms in Excel, that will be easier for them. Thank you very much. Here, they're writing in comments that they're reading Russian sources, but if they don't find information there, they proceed to searching in English. Another question, how well this approach means the SOC practices for risk management. If you consider ISO, if you consider 27005 or ISO 31300s, this approach doesn't contradict them. The major requirements of these standards is exactly in making sure that the risk assessment results should be reproducible and consistent. Especially, I think it's underlined in ISO 31300s. So it's a required thing that different experts should arrive at similar ideas and results. Thank you. Are there tools in the market that allow running the analysis that you have described? Yes. They said, I'm not sure that they exist in the Russian market. Or better say, I know two vendors who are preparing this toolkit. One of them didn't work in Russia, at least as of a year ago. One of them, I think, seems to be ready to work with the Russian audience. At least they were demoing the. One of them is Risklens. It's one of the developers of this factor risk analysis developers, and the other vendor is NoShoot. We talked to them this year. They showed us a demo version, and they run to the open version of the open fair standard. Thank you very much, Evgeny. Reminding you that it's risk management, Karzashchita, Evgeny Sachkov. Thank you all for the attention, and we'll come back to you after a short break. Thank you.